Hello and welcome into another episode of Hot Wax. This is episode 19. I am your host, Kurt Finn of Kurt Finn Music, and more recently, The Bad Excuses. It's good to be back here on Hot Wax. It's been taking me a little bit longer to get the episodes out due to it being summertime. Um, and for any of you that have grown up or lived any time in the Midwest or a place where you get the seasons, you'll know summer is very sacred. It's very fleeting. It happens uh, so quickly, and the older you get, it seems like the quicker it goes. And when I was growing up, I grew up in the Midwest, but when I lived in California and I lived in Arizona, I lived out west, summer never seemed to end. So, every day was summer. So it's just, so you try to fit so much time in. So, getting some of the pods together with some of the guys to do some of the ones we talked about has been a little bit more challenging than I originally thought. So, um, I'm going to press on with this next one I want to do. And why I mention it, the summertime, um, because I want to do an album that's one of my favorite summer albums of all time. And on Hot Wax, I've always kind of talked about you know this isn't even my favorite record from this band, but it is one of my favorite summer albums because of what it means to me and what the time meant to me and where I was growing up in the time. Um, but it is from one of my favorite bands, especially when I was growing up. So the album that we're going to do today on Hot Wax was released on Warner Brothers Records March 24th, um, 1986, which was a couple of days before my birthday. And it's kind of a controversial album. And I'm talking about the album from one of my favorite all time bands growing up and even now, Van Halen. And the album, and why I call it controversial, because the album we're going to do is 5150. And why is that controversial? Many would say, well, it was their first album with Sammy Hagar. It was the first album without David Lee Roth. Um, here's my copy of 5150, and it's funny because this is this is my original. This was like the original record. Um, and the funny thing is I also have it on cassette, and I have it on CD. I got the CD a little bit later, but my first copy was on vinyl and was on cassette. Uh, but even though the album was released in the springtime around my birthday, um, that summer and the summers after that, 5150 would be the soundtrack to many important things in my life and times and people and places and just being young. Uh, so as much as I love Van Halen, and okay, let's just reference in 1986 when Sammy joined the band, and I think he joined in about 1985. Van Halen had become the biggest fucking rock and roll band almost in the world. 1984 was one of the hugest records to ever come out in the 80s. And, you know, when I was growing up, Van Halen, AC/DC, Motley Crue, Metallica, Led Zeppelin, Black Sabbath, Aerosmith, all these hard rock bands were like my wheelhouse. They were like my escape. It meant the world to me to have these bands. You know, I had Van Halen, posters all over my wall. I did my guitar up like Eddie Van Halen. I painted my shoes like Eddie Van Halen. Tried to wear my hair like Eddie Van Halen. I just worshiped Van Halen. David Lee Roth in his he was one of the greatest frontmen, still was one of the greatest frontmen in the world. Every young teenage boy and every aspiring drummer sat around in class and tapped, to to Alex Van Halen, drumming, and Michael Anthony with his Jack Daniels drinking in his bass and his high voice and his high energy on bass and his rock steady bass. I mean, Van Halen was just fucking great. And 1984 and Diver Down were such a part of my musical vernacular and the language that I spoke of rock and roll, because those two albums came out and I was, amazed. Of course, I loved Van Halen 1. I mean, who doesn't? One of the greatest, if not the best, fucking first records a band has ever made. It's amazing I haven't done that one because we've done a lot of first albums. Um, and Van Halen 2 was just as kick ass, right? I mean, Van Halen 2 was awesome. And then you had Women and Children First, and Fair Warning. And I loved all those records. I had every one of them. Van Halen was my world. And after 1984, and you heard all those songs on the radio, I mean, in the tape, I mean, you had Panama, Jump, Hot for Teacher, I'll Wait. I mean, that album, 1984, was such an amazing album and such an amazing time in so many people's lives. Van Halen was huge. And David Lee Roth, I mean, Van Halen was MTV. David Lee Roth was Mr. MTV. I mean, Diamond Dave was one of the coolest fucking people I'd ever seen. And Eddie Van Halen was the greatest guitar player still. I mean, just an amazing guitar player. And what we were hearing on those records was something we had never heard before. And by 1984, when that record came out, Van Halen was the biggest band in the world. Their tours were grossing; they were sold out every night. But there was turmoil in the band, you know, um, it was known that David Lee Roth had made the comment that, we're a rock and roll band, we're a guitar rock band, we're not a synthesizer band. He didn't like some of that stuff that was coming out, David Lee Roth. And it was also rumored that David Lee Roth didn't like the fact that Eddie kind of started becoming more of the he kind of they moved the operation to the 5150 studios, at Eddie's house, where Eddie was giving, full autonomy to do anything he wanted, all the creativity that he wanted, you know, with a guitar workshop, recording studio, everything, so that kind of became the central location, for Van Halen. And that kind of irked David because now everything was kind of not on his time. And let's face it, front men are fucking crazy. He's an egomaniac. I mean, his ego got so huge, which happens with lead singers. David Lee Roth went out and did some solo stuff. I think it was California Girls and I'm Just a Gigolo, Crazy from the Heat, shit like that. And that kind of irked Van Halen. That that kind of pissed everybody off. Especially Eddie. Um, and Eddie had a hard time with that. He really didn't like it. So whatever you believed on MTV, you had heard that David Lee Roth quit the band. Um, you had heard that maybe David Lee Roth was fired. But nobody really knows. David went out and did Eat 'em and Smile. David had his band, Bassinet and Sheehan and Steve Vai, the Eat 'em and Smile shit. But when we heard that David Lee Roth was out of the band, a lot of us, huge Van Halen fans were like, whoa. It was like a gut punch. It was so disappointing because, the success of 1984 and the tours and everything. I mean, it was just something else. And to he was being replaced with Sammy Hagar, I was kind of like, I'm not really a big Sammy Hagar guy. Never have been. His stuff with Montrose, I guess, was okay. Some of it is worth collecting, but it doesn't do it for me. It's okay. You know, I can get into it. But some of the solo stuff, like VOA, you know what I mean? Like, we had some good songs, right? But it was just, wow, okay, you know, they're going with Sammy Hagar. So this will be their first album with Sammy Hagar, and I got to tell you what, um, it didn't disappoint. I remember we had waited so long, and we had heard so much about this record, obviously because it was all over the music news. Interviews with David Lee Roth, interviews with Van Halen, with Sammy, and everything, and the promises of how great this record was going to be. And I can tell you, when I got the record, I was so fucking excited. And when I put it on, oh, baby. And we heard that coming out of our speakers, man. It was like, okay, David who? You know what I mean? From that hello, baby. I mean, the song, the first track, Good Enough. It was amazing. I mean, it gave me such a chill, because this wasn't any bullshit. This wasn't very far few in between does a band lose their lead singer to, a lot of them lose them to, you lose them to death and you try to replace them. The Doors did real good with Ian Astbury, but that's just like a different thing. I mean, years later, AC/DC did with Bon Scott, but Bon Scott had died, and they replaced him. Black Sabbath, with Dio replacing Ozzy. There was it, it was so unheard of to be successful at it, but yet Van Halen somehow knocked it out of the park with 5150. There was something about it that it obviously was Van Halen, but there was a way that it progressed. There was something, I don't want to say mature about it, but there was something because look, Sammy wasn't. He was a rock and roller. It's not like he was a stranger to partying. You know. David Lee Roth started to think that he had become Van Halen, right? So even though the band was named Van Halen, David Lee Roth, as most charismatic, egotistical lead fucking singers are, like, this is my band. You'll be nowhere without me, baby, type of shit. And that happened to not be true. We're at that time, and I don't believe it was like that in the beginning, because Alex Van Halen has even referenced, hey, Van Halen died when David left the band. And I mean, that's how he feels. That's how he feels. I'm not a huge, I love the Sammy Hagar album because of the time again. Like OU812, the album after this, was a pretty good album. I like that one. Again, a lot of memories attached to it. For Unlawful Carnal Knowledge, a lot of memories attached to it. Love that record. The Without a Net, the live 5150 stuff, love that. By balance, I was gone. I could care less about Van Halen. I could care less when they brought Gary Cherone in. I didn't give a shit about Van Halen again until David Lee Roth came back in the fold and they came out with A Different Kind of Truth, which I think is a great fucking record. And I was so glad that David was able to come back, even though Michael Anthony was gone. Wolfie came in and played bass. I thought it was great. And this album was, I mean, to be okay. So the time and space of when I was living and when this album came out, it was such a different sound. The band had grown, but it was still a rock and roll band, and there was no doubt about that. No doubt whatsoever that this was a rock and roll band. It was still cheeky. It was still the fucking party, and the songs were still just as goddamn good. And it was again one of the biggest top-selling albums. I mean, it was right up there, with 1984. The success of 5150 was off the fucking charts. And again, to bring in a new singer and to be just as good. And the rumor has it that, Sammy Hagar wanted to name it Van Hagar, and the brothers were like, no, it's Van Halen, and it always will be that. Now, the one thing that this album started to change is that it started to have some ballad or some love songs. As David Lee Roth likes to say, love walks in. Why can't this be love? Singing about love. And what David Lee Roth would be, ain't talking about love. You know what I mean? So with Sammy's writing, yes, he was still kind of a rock and roller and can still, write some of those, kind of risque party rock and roll lyrics, but there was also a different side to Sammy's writing, which I, at that time I really dug. The album did pretty well on the billboards in the top 20s, and it was all over MTV, as you can remember some of the singles. The big singles was Why Can't This Be Love, Dreams, Love Walks In, and The Best of Both Worlds. I love those songs. Best of Both Worlds, 5150, all of those songs. But this album, that summer, and that's what I always like to talk about on Hot Wax, because, again, this isn't even my favorite Van Halen album. Not even close. But it's one of my favorite records because of what it meant to me. And that's kind of what record collecting is all about. And that's kind of what listening to music is all about, is the connection you have with it. The energy that it creates inside you when you hear it. Every time I hear 5150, I'm brought right back to that time. 1986, 1987, 1988. Sony Walkman headphone, riding my BMX bike around, hanging out with my buddies. Everywhere we went, we heard this record. You could be down at the video game parlor, playing video games. You could be at the local pool, and this album would be playing. You'd be at a friend's house, this album would be playing. My older sister, when I hung out with her friends, this album was always fucking playing. And the shock of it all, that it could be that good, but it was just such a great album and such a great time. This, like I said, it is a soundtrack to my life. And for many of us, it is. And the cool thing about it was the change of it all. When you go from 1984 to 5150, it is just so damn cool. And then you got Eddie was coming up with some really cool shit, and when you gave him the time to come up with things. Now the drums kind of changed a little bit more electronic drum sound, but Eddie was kind of at control. It was obviously was produced by Don Landy and Mick Jones, but Eddie was at the controls. Eddie was controlling this thing. This was Eddie's shit, right? So 5150 changed the landscape, I think, too, of recording. the way that music was recorded, the sound of everything, because when CDs were just getting popular, the CD came out, and I remember, I had the CD afterwards, after listening to it on vinyl and cassette. And I remember, putting it into the CD player when I got that, and I was like, holy shit, this album is fucking great. And then coming out with the Without a Net stuff, where Sammy Hagar was able to go into these live sets and kind of, you know, inject some of his songs. I Can't Drive 55, um, Eagles Fly, um, and those type of tunes, man. The Red Rocker, they were covering Led Zeppelin. They were doing some different things. The one thing I never really cared for was when Sammy would sing some of the David stuff, because just being a big David Lee Roth fan and still being a huge David Lee Roth fan, I just thought that he couldn't shine a candle to it. But same thing, when they got Van Halen back together, David Lee Roth wasn't singing the fucking Sammy Hagar tunes. I mean, he wouldn't be caught dead doing it. But I think to keep the Van Halen spirit alive, they would do that. But in 1986, when this record came out, like I said, it was just something so special. Um, you know, how cool the record was, number one. Before I would play my football games, before I would do anything, I would listen to, like Dreams, real synth, but, it was different. I mean, like I said, this was some of the different areas that Van Halen was starting to go into. You definitely had the hard rock stuff on this record, but some of the more radio friendly, poppier things, that attitude that Sammy was able to bring. One of my favorite all time tunes. We talk about summer, we talk about friends, we talk about parties and all that stuff and that feeling, but the song Summer Nights, man. And Eddie's guitar sound and everything. This is one of my favorite songs. I mean, everything on this album. Best of Both Worlds. It's another one of those albums, and I like to do that on Hot Wax, that I can talk about that from front to back. It is a fucking banger. You know what I'm saying? I mean, every song on the record is just amazing. And again, the feeling that I get from it, the remembering those friends that I had, finding myself, coming of age, experimenting with everything. Again, it kind of gave me this. It was like it was kind of my strength. It was something that gave me power. I had Van Halen. I was untouchable. I had Van Halen T-shirts, Van Halen on my walls. I mean, it was written on my school books, the VH. And with this album and the friends and the time that I was having in my life and that so many of us were having, this album was so quintessential to our youth. A time where, being young was really what it was all about. And bands were coming out with fucking records, and it felt good. It felt good. You know what I mean? It was just such a different time, and it was such a cool album. And to the Inside and all those things, and the song 5150. And Eddie had all the riffs, man. Eddie was one of the greatest guitar players that I had ever heard. One of the most innovative guitar players I've ever heard. Stands the test of time. There'll never be another one, Eddie. Now, the David Lee Roth albums were pretty cool. Eat 'Em and Smile, Skyscraper, Crazy from the Heat. And he had a decent band, but I will admit it was missing something. Dave missed Van Halen more than Van Halen missed Dave. And that is the God honest truth. I mean, I had all Dave's solo albums. But again, Van Halen with Sammy Hagar was just as big, if not bigger. I think they might have sold more records with Hagar to a certain point than they did with David Lee Roth. And when you look at the body of work, I mean, the body of work with Sammy and with David, I think they had more albums with Sammy Hagar, but when David Lee Roth came back into the band, unfortunately Michael Anthony wasn't invited. You had Wolf Van Halen come back, but that album, Different Kind of Truth, is an amazing record. I'd love to do a hot wax on that, but I don't own the record. It's a little pricey for my blood because not a lot of them were pressed. But I'd like to get that record. If anybody out there has that record and would like to do a hot wax with me, I'd love to. But when David Lee Roth came back into the band, they kind of, the Live from Tokyo album and the stuff they were able to do and have new material was great. But again, it's not as much as, David Lee Roth didn't have the band. He didn't have Eddie Van Halen. He didn't have Sammy Hagar, and he didn't have Michael Anthony. He had great producers. He had great stage presence, but he didn't have Van Halen. And Van Halen, I think that's why, 5150, Oh You Wait When 2 and 4, Unlawful Carnal Knowledge were such great fucking records and such huge records all over MTV. And let's face it, sold more than David Lee Roth, and the concert tours were bigger than David. And I love Diamond Dave. But that era with Sammy Hagar was huge. And 5150 catapulted them into stardom, man. Like a fucking rocket ship to the moon and back. It was something else. And seeing the concerts back in that time and everything was such an amazing joy. I remember the first time I heard the song On the Inside. It was such a kind of cool, funky party tune. What was that shit you gave me last night? All that stuff. It was such a great time to be alive. It was such a fun time to be part of everything and just enjoying being young and enjoying music. 5150 is always going to be in my heart, as those times will be with my family, my sister, with my friends at that time, the things that I did, those long summer nights, sneaking out, and the party, it always had 5150 on. And it's one of those records that is just so part of me and part of so many of the people that I grew up with and just part of our lives. Whether you like the Sammy Hagar era or not, this album was huge. I mean, it was bigger than life. I was so happy with it. I couldn't believe it because I could never replace Diamond Dave. But like I said, Sammy did a great job. Eddie was doing such a great job writing the record. And I just love 5150. And I love the feeling that I get as soon as I hear the first track to the last track. It brings me, like I said, right back to that time. And, even now when I listen to it, not necessarily does it bring me back sometimes, but it also, I listen to it now and it sounds so fresh and so vibrant and it just like, wow, it just wraps me up. And I'm like, man, I love this record. The production of it, everything about it, the cover, the new look Van Halen had. It was just everything. And, again, it's not even my favorite Van Halen album, but it's one of the favorite times in my life that I had ever had. It was just an amazing time. The people, the places, and everything that came along with the release of this record in those 2 summers. It was just amazing. It's again, that's why I wanted to do this record. As July's coming to an end and summer's, starting to wind down, this is the quintessential summer rock and roll album. So that being said, it's been awesome. As always, going through these records and going through my personal collection and record, talking about not only the historical significance of the records and the songs and the bands and the time, but also what it means to me, and also I hope that you can feel that too, like what it means to you. What these records means to you, what this music does. How it makes you feel when you look at the record and you read the lyrics and the print, and you put it on, and how it brings you back to these times, some of the older records. And on the newer records, you realize this is the time you're living in. But a record like 5150 to me is a time capsule. But I still think it sounds fresh, and it sounds wonderful, and I love the record. And it's always fun digging into my music collection and opening up the vaults and talking about, not only, like I said, the historical significance of these records, and what the band, factual information, but also what it means, to me on a personal level where you can relate to the music. So if you haven't listened to 5150 in a while, I totally, hope you'd go out and listen to it and, reconnect with it. But, if you're a Van Halen person, you listen to it all the time, you know what I'm talking about. You know, Van Halen 3, I mean, I just finally listened to that with Gary Sharon. You know, it was really Sammy and David, but, go back and listen to your Van Halen records. So, as always, over here at Hot Wax, it's been a pleasure. And just reminding you to spin what you love and love what you spin. See you next time on Hot Wax. Kurt Finn. All good things, guys.